The alarms tore through the shuttle before anyone understood what was happening. I remember the exact second it started, because I had been counting stars out of pure boredom, and then the calm hum of the engines turned into a harsh, rising whine that made every hair on my arm stand up. My name is Wren Alcott, and I had not spoken a full sentence to anyone at the Caliph Youth Academy in 4 months. That morning, sitting near the back of the school transport with my knees pulled to my chest, I never imagined that silence was about to end in the middle of open space, with 80 students and 4 teachers depending on whatever I did next. The academy was a school built for the gifted children of 11 different worlds, floating on a ring-shaped station above the planet Caliph Prime. My mother was the first human ambassador ever accepted into the threefold accord, and because of her position, I became the very first human many of these students had ever seen. They stared at me in hallways. They whispered in languages my translator packet caught half a second before they finished the thought. I let them believe I was slow, or shy, or simply strange. It was easier that way. Silence kept people from asking questions I did not want to answer. Questions about my father, about the colony where he died, about why a human girl flinched every time a door closed too fast. That day, we had been sent on a routine trip to observe a drifting comet field near the outer belt. It was supposed to be simple: watch, record data, return before the evening meal. Instead, the shuttle rocked hard to one side, and Instructor Bellu's voice cracked through the speaker system, asking everyone to remain calm in a tone that made it very clear she was not calm at all. Through the window I saw it, a long gray ship without any markings, cutting across our path far too quickly to be anything friendly. Unmarked ships near a school transport meant only one thing in this part of space: raiders. Groups that struck softer targets, grabbed what they wanted, and disappeared before any real fleet could respond. Our shuttle carried no defenses. Our teachers were scholars, not soldiers, and the single escort cruiser assigned to protect us had been pulled away an hour earlier, chasing a decoy signal 3 systems distant. I watched Instructor Bellu freeze at the main console, her hands hovering over controls she suddenly could not remember how to use. Beside me, a young Vantaran boy named Doran began to shake, tears rolling down his double-lidded eyes, his small hands gripping the edge of his seat, as if that alone could keep the ship steady. And something inside me that had stayed quiet for 4 straight months simply refused to stay quiet any longer. I stood up. My legs felt unsteady, but my voice, when it came out, sounded far calmer than I expected. I told everyone to move toward the rear compartment, and to move quickly. For a moment nobody responded, because the silent human girl from the back row had never spoken above a whisper before, and now she was giving orders like she had done this 100 times. I said it again, sharper this time, and something in the tone must have reached them, because feet started moving. Students grabbed each other's hands, teachers pushed students toward the rear seats, and the panic in the cabin shifted, just slightly, from paralysis into motion. What none of them knew was that I had grown up differently than any child on this station. After what happened to my father during an attack on our colony 3 years earlier, every school on Earth had begun teaching children survival response the same way other places taught music or mathematics. I had spent long months in an underground classroom, learning what to do when lights turned red and alarms sounded, long before I ever learned a single word of any alien language. My mother, before she became an ambassador, had worked as a crisis engineer, and she made absolutely certain her daughter understood what to do when everything around her started falling apart. I moved toward the pilot's console where Instructor Bellu stood frozen. She was a brilliant teacher, kind and patient in every lesson I had sat through, but nothing in her training had prepared her for a moment like this. I had spent 4 silent months quietly studying every part of that shuttle, memorizing switches and displays out of nothing but boredom and habit, because watching had always been the one thing my silence let me do well. I asked her where the manual override for the communication array was located. She pointed with a shaking hand, and I did not wait for permission before reaching past her. I opened every channel at once, unencrypted, broadcasting our exact position and direction. It felt dangerous, sending our location out into open space, where the raider ship could hear it too, but keeping quiet felt far more dangerous. I gave the raiders approximate heading as well, something I had worked out by watching the pattern of its engine exhaust drifting behind it. A small detail nobody else on that shuttle had thought to notice, because nobody else had spent the last 20 minutes staring silently out the window from pure habit. Then I did the thing that students would talk about for years afterward. The raider ship was not moving to strike us directly. It was slowing down, preparing to dock, which told me they wanted hostages rather than destruction. That distinction mattered. I had studied enough recordings from the colony attack to recognize the shape of a boarding approach, and I knew there would be a short window where their speed dropped low enough for their clamps to extend. I told Instructor Bellu to prepare a full reverse burn on my signal. She argued that we would lose too much speed, that we would drift helplessly. I told her that losing speed was exactly the plan. Their clamps were already extending toward us, timed for our current velocity. If we suddenly slowed, their ship would overshoot us instead of connecting, and it would take them nearly 2 minutes to correct their approach and try again. 2 minutes was not forever, but it was something, especially now that I had broadcast our exact location to anyone listening, including any escort cruiser that might come rushing back once it received the signal. She looked at me for a long moment, uncertain, frightened, but something in my steady voice must have convinced her, because she finally placed her hand on the control and waited. I told everyone to brace, to pull their seat webbing as tight as it would go, no matter how much it pinched. Then I gave the signal. The burn hit us all at once, slamming every body back against restraints hard enough to leave bruises the next day. Through the front window, I watched the raider ship's extended clamps sail past our hull with barely enough space to spare, its entire mass drifting forward in a slow, furious overshoot, while its engines roared to correct the mistake. I had told Bellu it would take them nearly 2 minutes to reposition. It took our escort cruiser far less than that to arrive, engines already engaged, because an unencrypted distress signal carrying our exact coordinates gave the fleet everything it needed to respond immediately instead of searching blindly through open space. The raider ship broke away the moment the cruiser appeared, vanishing into a jump before any real confrontation could happen. The whole event, from the first alarm to the last flicker of the raider's engine trail disappearing into the dark, lasted less than 4 minutes. It felt, at the time, like it had lasted an entire lifetime. For a while after we docked safely back at the academy, nobody said anything either. The silence in that shuttle was different now, filled with something closer to disbelief than fear. Doran, the Vantaran boy who had been crying beside me, reached over and gripped my hand so tightly it almost hurt, and he did not let go until we reached the docking bay. News of what happened spread through the academy faster than any lesson ever had. By the next morning, students I had never spoken a single word to were approaching me in hallways, asking careful questions in overly polite standard, as if I might break apart if handled the wrong way. Instructor Bellu recommended me for a formal citation that I never asked for, and honestly did not want. The Okasi students who used to call me the silent pet behind translator delay now went quiet themselves whenever I walked past, though this silence felt different, closer to respect than mockery. I did not know how to feel about any of it. Being invisible had been simple. It had let me exist without explaining anything about my father, about the colony, about the year I spent learning survival drills instead of playing with other children my age. Now people looked at me and saw someone capable, someone who had made a decision under pressure that saved an entire shuttle of students. And I was not entirely sure that person matched who I actually felt like inside. That evening my mother called from her post in the Accord's main station, an actual live transmission rather than a recorded message, which for someone in her position was close to a small miracle given how busy her schedule always was. I told her everything, the alarms, the raider ship, the reverse burn, the way Doran had held my hand the entire ride back. She listened without interrupting, something she rarely did. And when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She did not tell me she was proud, because she knew how much I disliked that particular phrase, after everything it had come to mean following my father's death. Instead, she said that I had watched, and that watching was exactly what he had spent so much time teaching me to do. She told me that watching was never the same thing as hiding, even though I had spent months confusing the two, and she said she believed I had finally understood the difference. I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. I thought about the months I had spent staying quiet in hallways, convincing myself that silence was armor, that saying nothing meant staying safe. In some ways, it had kept me safe. Nobody asked questions I did not want to answer. Nobody pushed for details about the colony, or about the empty chair at our dinner table, or about why loud noises still made my chest tighten even years later. But somewhere along the way, I had also convinced myself that silence meant smallness, that staying invisible was the only way I knew how to survive in a place built for children who were not like me. The attack changed that, whether I wanted it to or not. It was not the danger itself that changed things, not really. It was the moment I chose to stand up when everyone else had frozen, the moment I let my voice fill a room instead of shrinking away from it. That single choice unraveled 4 months of careful invisibility in less than 4 minutes, and there was no putting it back together afterward, even if I had wanted to. In the weeks that followed, I noticed small shifts everywhere around me. Doran began following me during free periods, not out of pity, but because he genuinely wanted to understand how I had known what to do when even the adults on that shuttle had frozen. I found myself answering his questions patiently, walking him through the basic principles my mother had once drilled into me, watching his serious little face light up every time something finally made sense to him. Teaching him felt strange at first, since I had spent so long avoiding conversations of any kind, but it also felt oddly steady, like finding solid ground after months of standing on something unstable. The Okasi students who once whispered about the silent pet slowly began including me in study groups, hesitantly at first, unsure how to approach someone who had suddenly become something closer to a legend among the younger students. I still preferred quiet corners and short answers, but I no longer felt the need to disappear entirely into the background the way I once had. There was a difference, I was learning, between choosing silence and hiding behind it, and that difference mattered more than I had ever realized before that day on the shuttle. Instructor Bellu asked to speak with me privately about 2 weeks after the incident. She told me she had spent every night since replaying the moment in her mind, wondering what would have happened if I had stayed silent, the way I always had before. She admitted that she had frozen completely, that her training as an educator had never prepared her for a moment, demanding immediate action rather than careful explanation. She thanked me, not with grand words, but with a simple, honest acknowledgement that surprised me more than any citation ever could. I told her that freezing was not a failure, that even trained adults sometimes needed a single unexpected voice to break through the fear holding them in place. She looked at me like she had not expected such steady words from someone my age, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, I felt like an equal in that room, rather than an outsider being studied from a careful distance. My mother visited the academy in person the following month, her first visit since I had arrived, and she asked to see the shuttle where everything had happened. We stood together at the observation window, looking out at the same stretch of stars I had once counted out of boredom, and she asked me quietly whether I regretted losing the quiet life I had built for myself over those 4 months. I thought carefully before answering, because it was not a simple question. Silence had protected me in ways that still mattered, ways I was not ready to fully give up. But hiding, I realized, had cost me things too. Connections I might have built earlier, friendships that could have eased the loneliness I carried since we left Earth. I told her that I did not regret what happened, even though I still valued quiet moments more than most people my age seemed to. She smiled at that, a small, tired smile that carried years of worry behind it, and told me that my father would have said the exact same thing. She reminded me that he had never been a loud man either, that his strength had always come from careful observation rather than noise, and that the two of us shared more in common than I sometimes allowed myself to believe. Standing there beside her, looking out at the stars that had once seemed so distant and cold, I felt something settle inside me that had been unsettled since the day we buried an empty container in place of a body that could never be recovered. Life at the academy slowly returned to something resembling normal, though normal now looked different than it had before. I still chose quiet corners during meals, still preferred listening over speaking in most conversations, but I no longer felt the need to disappear completely whenever someone looked my way. Doran remained close, often sitting beside me during lessons, occasionally asking questions about Earth that I answered as honestly as I could, without dwelling too long on painful memories. The Okasi students greeted me by name now instead of whispering behind careful translator delay, and though I never became someone who filled rooms with endless conversation, I stopped needing to prove that silence made me small. Months later, during a formal gathering held to honor students who had shown exceptional courage, Instructor Bellew asked me to say a few words in front of the assembled classes. I stood at the front of that hall, facing rows of faces from 11 different worlds, and for a moment, old habits urged me to stay quiet, to let someone else speak on my behalf, the way I always had before. Instead, I thought about that shuttle, about Doran's shaking hands, about the moment I chose to stand rather than freeze, and I opened my mouth and spoke. I told them that silence had once felt like the only shield I had, a way of protecting myself from questions I was not ready to answer, from a grief I had not yet learned how to carry. I told them that the attack on our shuttle had taught me something my mother had tried to explain long before I understood it myself, that watching carefully and speaking up when it truly mattered were not opposites, but partners working together. I told them that every person in that hall carried strengths shaped by where they came from, whether that meant careful observation, quiet patience, or the simple willingness to act when everyone else hesitated. When I finished, the hall remained quiet for a moment, and then applause rose gently through the room, not overwhelming, but warm and steady, filling the space in a way that felt entirely different from the silence I had once used to hide myself. Doran clapped loudest of anyone, grinning at me from his seat near the front, and I found myself smiling back without any of the discomfort I once felt whenever attention turned toward me. Walking out of that hall afterward, I thought about how strange it was that a single frightening moment aboard a small unarmed shuttle had reshaped an entire chapter of my life. I was still the same quiet girl who preferred listening to speaking, who valued careful thought over quick reaction in most situations, but I had also become someone willing to raise her voice when silence would have cost far more than any risk of being noticed. I had learned that watching the world carefully was never the same thing as disappearing from it, and that lesson, more than any citation or formal recognition, felt like the truest gift that Frightening Day had given me. I still think about that shuttle sometimes, about the way alarms tore through calm air, about Doran's trembling hands and Instructor Bellew's frozen expression at the console, but mostly, I think about the moment I stood up, the moment my voice filled a silent room after 4 long months of holding it back. That single choice changed how an entire school saw me, but more importantly, it changed how I saw myself, and for the first time since arriving at that station far from everything familiar, I finally felt like I belonged exactly where I stood.